Okay. Yeah, so welcome everybody to our last pre-eval session. Like Jason said, if you've made it this far, congratulations. um, and thanks for sticking with us throughout this. So today what we're going to be doing is we're going to look over this analyze and mobilize. So this idea of how to actually analyze and use the data you've collected, and then how to actually then put what you've found into practice and make your evaluation actually useful to you. So keeping that in mind, given that this is our last webinar, throughout, please provide any feedback, questions, comments in the chat or in the Q&A, whether it's about this webinar or something else, or just a general evaluation question that you feel like we haven't covered. Please just pop that in. If we can't get to it today, we'll make sure that we write down your email or your name or something and address it in another way. And at the end, we'll just have a poll and some information on like how to get your certificates, where to access more resources, all that kind of good stuff. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Jason.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kirsty. So as Kirsty mentioned, the topic for today, we're going to talk about analyzing and mobilizing data. Now, obviously, to do a decent job in talking about data analysis, you probably need to have like the entire semester's worth or two of courses. So, but by necessity, we're going to do kind of an overview approach and give you kind of some examples of ways in which we can examine data and kind of from a general perspective. And as Kirsty said, if you have specific questions or things that are unique to your organization or the things that you're working on, then please do reach out to us, and we'd be happy to provide more one-on-one kinds of information to you. But for today, as I said, we're going to focus on kind of an overview approach and trying to tie together a lot of the things that we've been covering over the course of these 8 pre-eval workshops, including sort of tying stuff that we're talking about today back to those evaluation questions that we talked about in previous webinars, to our evaluation purpose, and ultimately back to a lot of the stuff that we talked about with including our stakeholder maps and thinking about who's involved in our evaluation, not only in terms of the people that we're collecting data from, which we've talked about in the past couple, but also how to report back and how to make sure that data we're collecting kind of that we complete the circle, and that the data that we're collecting actually makes its way back to the people who need it to be able to make decisions or even just to be informed about the results of our evaluation. So to start off with then, we're going to talk about 2 basic types of evaluation analysis or evaluation of our data. One, obviously, so we're going to focus on something called qualitative data analysis, and the other one we're going to focus on or talk a little bit about, but it won't be the focus of our discussion today, would be quantitative analysis. So these 2 types of analysis procedures, I sometimes hesitate because often what you'll find is you get into like schools of thought where people tend to think, oh, you can only do this one, or you can only do this one, or one is good or one is bad, which I think is the wrong way to think about kind of approaches to analysis. To me, the most effective analysis tends to be the one that helps you answer the questions that you have. So if you go back to your evaluation questions and what those questions are, what is it you're trying to do? What is it you're trying to be able to say? And that will help inform you as to what approach is the most appropriate for the analysis of your data. So when we're talking about qualitative data analysis, qualitative data analysis, pardon me, tends to, again, and these are overall sort of generalizations and simplifications, but in a lot of ways, qualitative tends to focus more on understanding what the participants or the respondents are experiencing. And so as a result of that, what we try to do is gather a little bit more in-depth information, typically on fewer participants. Quantitative tends to look more at generalization. And again, remember, these are gross simplifications of these processes, but in general, if we're looking at quantitative, we're looking at numbers to be able to describe experiences, scenarios, situations, people's expectations. We are looking to make generalizations beyond the sample that we're collecting data from. So if I have a survey of like 300 people, often what I'm doing with a quantitative approach is I'm going to then try to make inferences to a broader population. So if I said, I'm wondering how Albertans feel about inclusive education, for example. I might collect data from 300 people, and then I make generalizations saying this is the current state of people's perceptions regarding this particular topic. Qualitative, what I might do in contrast to that is actually gather data maybe from fewer people, and I could do interviews, for example, or I could do focus groups or other types of things where I'm collecting more in-depth information. But what I'm doing in this particular case is I'm trying to understand what the respondents or participants are trying to tell me in that particular case. So again, it's more of a deep dive. It's not necessarily guided by universal rules, tends to be a little bit more ongoing, fluid, definitely an iterative process. And then other things that kind of distinguish between qualitative and quantitative. Quantitative, what we're trying to do in terms of context is ensure that we have a representative sample, but in a lot of ways, what we're trying to do is make sure that the context is not important to our analysis. And so we do things like we try to get random samples to make sure that all of the individual differences among our participants or respondents are canceled out. In qualitative, we don't necessarily do that. What we want to do is we want to understand the context from which people are responding from, and we take that into account when we're doing our analysis. And so, pardon me, if you look at some of the basic approaches or key approaches in terms of trying to understand this, again, some of the things that we're looking at here for qualitative would be things like, for example, content analysis. And this could be, and there's lots of uses of this one. I use this one a lot. For example, when I'm doing surveys, I might have an open-ended text box. And then what I'll do is I'll do a content analysis to look at the frequency of certain phrases or words or other things that come through in terms of the responses that I have there. And what I might do with that is, again, just try to understand what are the most frequent kinds of words or comments that end up showing up in that type of like a text box or other type of thing. I could also do like a thematic analysis, either in the case that I just described where it's an open-ended text box in a survey, or for example, if I'm doing interviews, what I could do then is try to go through the transcripts of the interviews or the focus groups and look for kind of consistent themes that seem to pop up. Now, I can do this either based on pre-existing themes that I've already decided on looking for, or these could be emergent themes. As I'm reading through the transcripts, what might happen is I'm seeing a lot of comments about the impact of COVID on mentorship programs. And as a result, then this could be what I would classify as an emergent theme that comes up. And so what I could do is I'm going through, I kind of create a list of these emergent themes. And then I could code my data based on those themes. And then, no, I'm just giving you examples of some ways that you could do this. This is going to be unique to your own kind of data that you collect, but that would be typical for, again, qualitative data. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so if we move on then to the next slide. One of the things, and this was to tie back to what we talked about very early on in our pre-eval series, was we talked about stakeholder mapping and understanding who the stakeholders are. And so if we kind of come full circle again, not only is it important for us to understand who the stakeholders are when we're designing our evaluation processes, like who we're going to collect data from, but also thinking about who those stakeholders are when it comes to analysis. And then in a little bit, we'll talk about sharing data or mobilizing data. So one of the useful techniques that we can often use when we are analyzing data is to also involve stakeholders in the analysis of data. Now, again, this doesn't mean that you have to include all stakeholders at the same level, but especially if you're doing community-based evaluation, there is and can be a benefit to tying in or including some of your stakeholders in the analysis of data. And the reason why I mention this is, and again, imagine that I'm coming in from the outside, helping someone or an organization do an evaluation. I might know a lot about evaluation, but what I don't know and don't have a lot of extensive knowledge of often is the context, or other things related to the specifics around the groups that are involved in this analysis. And so what can be really useful is circling back to stakeholders to get them to help you understand what the data actually means. And so you can get new perspectives, you can understand what the data actually is telling you. And so, for example, again, just to give you an example, if I was doing surveys with a particular group, I might be able to tell them about frequencies and say, 90% of people indicated this, 20% of people indicated that. But what I can't do is tell you the so what. So is that important, right? Is 90% meaningful? And this is where you really get that insight from your stakeholders. Again, with our thematic analysis, I can go through and I can figure out, I can say, this looks like a, kind of an important theme because it's mentioned frequently or people are talking about it a lot. But then I can circle back to my stakeholders and ask them, like, is this something that actually resonates? Does this make sense? Is this important? Am I, interpreting this correctly? So again, it helps make sense. The other thing that's important, and I think this goes back to some of the things we were talking about with trying to make sure ensure we have buy-in from our stakeholders when we're developing questions. But the same thing applies when we're doing the analysis. Including stakeholders in the analysis also can contribute to a sense of accountability in our stakeholders for taking ownership of the data, but also hopefully will help to mobilize that data or help that data to actually be used and not just ignored or put in a shelf if it's not something that was expected or wanted in the first place. And then also we can look at then, so what? Now what do we do after we've got this data? And there could be next steps or other types of things that we might want to do. So what are some ways that we can include stakeholders? A data party, which sounds really weird. If you're thinking about, most people are thinking about parties and data analysis. But I mean, I think grab some pizza, some coffee, some cookies, bring people together and to just take a look at the data. And there's lots of different ways to do this. And again, whether you consider this a party or not, some of the things that I've been involved in where I'll just bring the data to an organization and we'll present the data and we'll walk through the findings, talk about them. I'll give them my perceptions and then we can just have a conversation about what that data looks like and what is actually kind of telling us. Community forums, this would be more of it would be interactive. I think in terms of maybe a little bit less interactive than a data party. But a community forum where you can present back data that you found and open the floor for questions. Other types of meetings where we can have sort of selected findings where we bring to like a stakeholder meeting, a steering committee meeting, other types of things to present highlights or other types of things to get their input. And again, this could be at various stages in the data analysis. It could be prior to you actually looking at anything. It could be once you've done a preliminary analysis. It could be once you've kind of gone through and figured out kind of like the main findings. You could go and then you could present those back. And so again, there's lots of various iterations and different types of things that we could do to ensure that we're analyzing the data in ways that make sense and ensuring hopefully that the data is useful and will be used by the participants. So once we've analyzed the data, then and then, guys, there's no clear distinction between analyzing and presenting data, again, if we're including our stakeholders in our analysis. But there will be also stakeholders who aren't going to be involved in analysis, but nonetheless still need to be included in terms of findings and analysis. And again, I think, for example, like a funder may not be interested in coming to your data analysis party, but definitely would be interested in what the findings are from your evaluation. And so I want to spend just a few minutes talking about some approaches to representing data. I do have a colleague here, Rebecca Gokert from the university, and she's going to spend a little bit more time talking about some examples of that. So I'm not going to spend tons of time on this, but again, just as an overview, in terms of representing data, part of this, again, going back to the stakeholders, thinking about the needs of your stakeholder, but also the capacity of your stakeholders to understand and use the data that you're presenting. I've shared this with my colleagues, but I remember back when I finished my graduate degree and started working, and I was my first evaluation that I was doing for a client, and I was super excited, and I came back and told my colleague I was going to do all these amazing modeling techniques and advanced statistical analysis and everything like that. And he was really good because he kind of stopped me and said, that's all great, that sounds really interesting, but nobody's going to understand that, and nobody wants that. Which was really good because it really made me stop and think about the analysis, and really the mindset that I had been coming from was what was interesting to me and what did I want to do with the data. And I kind of had to change my perspective and think about, it's not really about me, it's about the people I'm working with and what do they need and what's going to be most useful for them. And so that really kind of helped me frame my mindset now when I'm thinking about how I'm going to represent the data is what's going to be the most useful for the people who are going to be using this data and reading this data. And so it may not be a 500-page report. It might not be advanced statistical analysis. It could be an infographic, right? It could be a chart. It could be, a series of transcripts. It could be that I present a PowerPoint presentation, right? So there's, again, numerous ways for me to do this. In the interest of time, perfect. Yeah, I'm just going to sort of shift over here. So again, some key things that we could do. So for qualitative, again, themes, quotes, graphics, videos sometimes are really useful. Audio recordings, allowing people to hear participants. Mind maps. Remember when Dr. Cyril came, she talked about arts-based methods and some of those methods. For quantitative, again, this could be simple descriptive statistics, averages, standard deviations, or it could be bar charts, pie charts, tables, infographics, and the list goes on and on and on. And again, part of this is, and I just want to really reiterate this, is instead of sort of thinking about it has to be this or it has to be this, thinking about who's going to be using the data and thinking about what's the best modality or medium to be able to share that data in a way that's going to help them do what they need to do most effectively, I think is sort of when it comes down to it, the key thing that we want to think about when we're looking at this. So some strategies. Again, there's 3 approaches: written, visual, oral. And this is just a laundry list of different types of things that you could do. And again, different modalities for sharing data. This is not exhaustive. Definitely, there's other ways you can do this. As I've mentioned before, my bias always, and this is the way my brain works. I have a very linear brain. I like reports. I like graphs. I like charts. But not everybody's like me. Like there's a lot of other people that I don't want to read 200 pages. I don't want to do this. Just show me what this looks like. I remember doing a report for a government agency one time, and they said, just include lots of pictures. Government loves pictures. So I'm like, okay. So I included lots of pictures. I didn't include much word. I just had lots of pictures, and then I would describe a picture. I would describe a chart. And that particular organization loved it. I mean, to me, I was nervous. That was the first time I'm like, I don't see how I can do this and not include all of the rationale and all of the background statistics and everything like that. And they're like, nah, we don't want that. Put that in appendix. Just put lots of pictures. So again, that was me learning. Okay, it's not about me. It's about what they want and what they need. All right. And so the other thing, again, and this is the one I'll kind of end on. Then I'll turn it over to my colleague Rebecca. The other thing to think about in terms of this, and this will go back to your stakeholders, as we mentioned before, is we can also have sort of more or less interactive kind of approaches to sharing data. As I said, I like the less interactive, give me a report and I'll read it on my own time. Not everybody's like that. Some people want to have like a lot of interaction and be involved in it. Some people want less. And so again, here are some examples of different types of things that we can do to ensure that we're meeting the needs of the people who are using the data. And so with that, I am going to, Kirsty, do you want to do an intro to Rebecca or?
Yeah, sure.
or-
And just for people to know, I'll just quickly flash these slides. And if you want to read them in more depth, you can go to our website, watch the recording later and pause it. But I'll flash these ones as things you can read for like some more definition style stuff that's much less interesting than actually seeing what it looks like in actuality. So with that said, oh, this is a resource. I think we've talked about this one before. Okay, now we're here. Lots to cover today. All right, so yeah, today we're joined by Dr. Rebecca Gokert. She's the director of the ECN and a professor at the University of Alberta. Rebecca's work aims at being responsive to early childhood communities and measurement needs by providing access to educational opportunities, resources, basically what we're doing here. Is a lot of what she does. So she's got lots of evaluation experience and expertise. And today she's going to share some of that with us with some examples of knowledge mobilization that she has been a part of. So Rebecca, I've got your slides, so I will pass it over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Kirsty, for the intro. And I'm just going to pick up where Jason left off and maybe some of those slides that quickly got forwarded. So what I'd like to chat about today is using and mobilizing evaluation data to support your work. So in our short time together, I'm going to talk about the importance of evaluation use and ensuring that your evaluation findings get used. So that's the thing. It's not just enough to do the evaluation. We want to make sure that it gets used in some way. How critical communication is in this process. So what we communicate, how we communicate, and with whom we communicate. I'm going to talk a little bit really briefly about embedding evaluative thinking and reflective practice into your day-to-day work. And then I'll finish off by sharing some of my go-to resources, as well as some ways that I've mobilized and supported the use of evaluation findings in my work, or some examples from my colleagues as well. Okay. So using evaluation data. So the first step in using evaluation data is really to link it back. And I think, Jason, you sort of hammered this point home, is really linking it back to your original evaluation purpose and questions. So what was the objective of the evaluation? What did you hear? And how can you relate what you heard back to the purpose and the questions, right? So Jason talked a lot about data collection, data analysis. You've got your data now, and now it's time to use it, right? So it's really important to think, what can I learn from the data that's going to tell me what's important? What did the data mean for my initiative, my organization, my clients, my participants, the stakeholders, and what am I going to do about it, right? So as I mentioned, it's not enough just to sort of have the data and just share it. Like, how am I going to actually mobilize it and get people on board and interested in that so that we use this information to make some kind of change, whether it's a practice change, policy change, or some kind of programmatic change. So really acting on what you've learned. So there are very many aspects to evaluation that can affect how information is going to be used. So of course, you know, the stakeholder needs, right? Like, what do they need from this evaluation? And Jason, thank you for sharing that you went through stakeholder mapping. So, you know, if you've mapped out your stakeholders, you sort of have a sense of kind of who are those internal stakeholders, who are those, you know, users of the program or participants of a program, all the way out to some of those peripheral stakeholders that we certainly want to know about our evaluation findings and how awesome our programs are, because maybe they want to give us money, they're funders, or they're decision makers, right? So really keeping those folks in mind. Again, the evaluation purpose is really important, right? Like, what was the purpose of the evaluation? Was it to understand how the program is operating so that we can use the information to make some shifts and changes? Is it for a funding purpose? Is it to scale up, to start offering the program with different kinds of participants or in a different context? So again, thinking about that target audience. So in order to ensure, so we'll just go to the next slide, that our evaluation findings get used, you will want to communicate in ways that speak to various people, right? Whether they're internal people or they're external people to your evaluation. And so we're thinking about that stakeholder map, right? You can use committees. I don't know if you've talked at all about committees. So if you already have, existing staff meetings in place, advisory, operations, boards, steering committees, maybe you have an evaluation committee, engaging them in this work, right? So having them kind of, thinking about the data that is going to come and how you might want to mobilize it, because ultimately some of those committees have various stakeholders on them, right? They come at the information from a very different kind of perspective. So they might be able to support thinking about how you sort of mobilize and share the findings with different audiences. And of course, be as creative and engaging as you can. So Jason, acknowledged that he loves reports, but not everybody does, right? And that's not going to be the most engaging way for some people, right? So really thinking about how do you make this engaging? How do you support understanding of the information? And how do you sort of help people prioritize what can be used in order to make some of those shifts and changes? So in order to do this, we'll just go to the next slide. It's really about ensuring that your evaluation data gets used, right? Both internally within your organization and also externally. So that's really kind of fostering this, culture of wanting to use information, right? Not just kind of generating it for the sake of it and then letting it sit on a shelf and gather dust. So there's a few things that you can think about to foster this. So designing the evaluation with those intended users in mind, right? Always having front of mind, who are our stakeholders? Maybe it's the participants, right? Maybe it's funders, maybe it's your decision makers, your board, parents, whoever is involved. Consider even rehearsing how different kinds of conclusions might affect program operations with stakeholders. So you might want to think about, okay, if this was our finding, or if it's a little bit controversial, how might we share that? What might the reactions be to that? How might we use that information? So kind of rehearsing that in advance. Providing continuous feedback to stakeholders. So again, don't wait till the very end. Actually, we should always talk about evaluation use and knowledge mobilization almost right up front, right? When we're planning an evaluation, how do you actually build it in so that you're giving constant feedback throughout, especially if you're trying to make program shifts or changes and use your data, in an ongoing way, and not just waiting to the end and then say, oh, shoot, we're now a year into this thing and we should have made those changes back when we found out that running our program from 9 to 3 Monday to Friday wasn't actually meeting our client needs, right? So kind of always looking at your data, and it's never going to be perfect, so you don't always have to wait to the end. Scheduling follow-up meetings is really important, and thinking about those natural spaces and environments where meetings already happen and how can you tag on some of that information sharing. And then, as I've stated already, is really tailoring those communication strategies to meet your stakeholders' particular needs. Okay, so I said communication was important. So I'm just going to share a couple guidelines. You can probably read this, but it's really important. Again, think about that stakeholder map. So prioritizing, who do you need to share this information with first, right? Especially sometimes when you have sensitive information, you want to think about who needs to know about that first. Ultimately, sometimes it's your key decision makers, right? And those decision makers could be your clients, your participants. Those decision makers could be your program staff, or it could be others. So really thinking about that. Ideally, of course, we're working primarily in virtual environments, but presenting in person, right? So you're sharing your information. So not just handing over, hey, the report's attached, take a look and we'll talk about it later, or maybe we won't. So really getting people engaged in a focused conversation. Making reports available, of course, in the languages that are most appropriate to the clients that you serve and the communities in which you work, but also thinking about language from an accessibility point of view, and that's what Jason kind of pointed out. So what is going to make this actually accessible to people that are reading it? Frame the information, the results, according to the information people need. So, while you might want to include lots of, lovely methods and quantitative models, that may not actually be relevant for your stakeholders. So really kind of think about, what is the key information I need to share in order for people to use that information? And sometimes a lot of the other information is noise, right? So make sure that you're sort of cleaning out the noise and getting really focused about what you're sharing. And of course, I said this before, involving stakeholders throughout the process always gives you that diversity of perspective. It's kind of like a check. You know, people can say, oh, that's interesting. I wouldn't interpret that way, or I wouldn't have thought that, you know, that's how we would share that information, because that's not what that means in the context of our community or in the context of our program. And Jason kind of mentioned when you've got an external evaluator coming out, they may not be privy to the context and the culture sometimes of a program, a community, or an organization. So it's really important to have those checks and balances. And then also to communicate sensitive information with care, right? Because we need to think very cautiously about who we share information with, because information is power. And we ultimately want to do something about it. So we have to be, you know, very sensitive about what we share and who we share it with and in what ways. So the next slide is just a reminder. Jason showed this slide already. So strategies for sharing results. I don't know, Kirsty, if you had removed it from my, oh no, it's still here. So this is just a refresher. But one of the things to be very, you know, I mean, and I'm very aware of this, is that you don't have to limit yourself to just sharing findings through a report. Sometimes this is a requirement. But there's lots of other mechanisms, and as Jason pointed out, from like less interactive to really interactive. But again, also you need to think about your audience and budget and capacity, right? We might want to put together all these lovely things. We might want to host, you know, community forums and events and dialogues, but you may not have the budget to do that or the capacity to do that. So it's really important to think about what are some of the natural things that you can do that already exist, right? You've already got the meetings booked. So for example, presenting findings at staff meetings, building it right in, baking it right into natural spaces and processes, maybe developing short videos on findings. So there's lots of kind of software that's available now that's free, like those whiteboard videos, things like that, that are kind of engaging. Sharing findings on your organizational intranet or any kind of communication platform that you might be using. You could share stories, pictures, drawings. So Jason, you mentioned arts-based methods. So if you use those as the ways that you collected data, those can actually be wonderful ways to actually showcase findings and illustrate that. And you can have that kind of posted up around your organization. You can also, you know, post up findings and get feedback about those findings. So we've done things before where you have a massive kind of infographic or kind of a billboard at the front of, you know, as you welcome people into your space, and you might have a, you know, what I like about this, what's working, what's not, and people can kind of put dots, or they can put stickies right up there, or maybe there's whiteboard markers or whatever. So you're kind of getting, you know, feedback really on the fly. Or, you know, producing a series of short memos that go out, those kind of things, just little sound bites of what you're hearing. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears. I had said I was going to talk about, you know, fostering evaluation use, the importance of communication. I want to talk a little bit about engaging in reflective practice. So really integrating evaluative thinking into your work. So again, if you're working on a shoestring budget, limited capacity, off the side of your desk, which is probably the case for most people on this call, including myself in much of the work that I do. So it's really important to think about how you can use and communicate evaluation findings, you know, just in those natural spaces, as I just said in the previous slide. So one of the most effective ways to build in evaluative thinking or reflective practice into your day-to-day work is really thinking about the culture, right? What culture do you sit in? What are those natural places and times that you can really utilize? So the next slide just kind of gives a few kind of tips around promoting evaluative thinking. So, you know, creating a learning environment. So always thinking about evaluation as a learning opportunity. I think a lot of people get their backs up when they hear the term evaluation, whether they're being evaluated or whether they're being asked to participate. It just feels like more work, right? So, but if we create a space where it's like, no, we're actually here to learn. We want to know what we're doing well. We want to celebrate that. We want to find out where we can make improvements and what those improvements are. And we want to hear from those individuals that we serve, right? If it's children, it's youth, it's families, whoever we're serving. So creating safe spaces to do that, scheduling time to engage in evaluative thinking. So often we'll say, okay, there's the findings, move on, next item on the agenda. And we actually don't give ourselves enough space to reflect and think about the findings and what they mean. And also thinking about your group dynamics, right? So sometimes if I'm the person offering the program and my, boss or decision makers in the same room, that might feel punitive, right? If somebody's giving me, or I'm hearing about how that evaluation is going, if it has to do with the program I'm delivering, and vice versa. So really thinking about how do you sort of create those spaces where people can be reflective and share their thoughts on what are we finding and how do we actually use this information in our work. So I'll just skip over a few of these because you can read them, but you can engage in critical thinking and review, right? So it's really important to check assumptions. So oftentimes, if we are just always kind of presenting our findings to the same kind of people, it's like you're presenting in an echo chamber, right? Like you're patting yourself on the back and you're hearing from the same kind of voices and perspectives. So it is important to be critical about the information. Actually, Jason and I did an evaluation together, and it was an organization that said like our satisfaction surveys are always like so positive and 99%, and people say we're doing such a great job. We just like this, I mean, we know we're awesome, but this just can't be the case. Like, please dig deeper. So that was them sort of reflecting and going, are people being honest in these surveys? But we want to improve. We know we're not perfect at what we do, so maybe we need to try some different methods, right? And so they were doing awesome, but we did uncover some areas, and we had to, Jason, as you pointed out, we had to use some qualitative techniques where we could go and have conversations with people and get a little more context, right? Versus the Likert scale of, how good was that on a scale of 1 to 10 type of information. And then also always closing that feedback loop. So there's nothing more frustrating than when we ask people to fill out information, we gather data on them, or you as a staff member are being asked to do this, and then you never know what happens with it, right? So it's really important to kind of close that feedback loop and engage people to say, here's what we heard. We've summarized that, and even putting it out to your participants, to your clients, to anybody who's actually interested, as long as it's appropriate, of course. Okay, and then just one final slide on that. And this is just a strategy actually a colleague of mine uses. So again, think about how often you want to meet and share information and with whom. So if you have natural spaces, again, this is when you're trying to think about how do you engage in reflective activities and strategies with your staff, with your organization, even with your participants. This is just kind of a strategy they use, and you could have that up on a big whiteboard. Of course, if we're working in a virtual platform, there's lots of things like Jamboard and Whiteboard and Zoom and that, but really asking, what did we learn? Like, we just heard a bunch of information. What did we learn? What new ideas did we get? What's working and what can we do better, right? So asking those 4 simple questions, they're not super threatening, and you can generate a fair bit of information about that too. And you'll notice the bold at the bottom, always close the feedback loop. So I think I hammered that point home already. Okay, so I'm curious to hear from you. I know we only have the chat function, but I'd love to hear in the chat, just as I'm continuing to go, what are some ways that you've shared evaluation data? Any kind of creative or unique ways, or just ways that seem to work for you and your organization? And do you have any go-to resources? Like there's a website, there's a tool, there's some magical, video kind of product that you use. I'd love to hear about it, because I teach a lot, and I always ask my students, and they teach me about all of these fantastic tools that I don't have the capacity to learn or use, but there's so much out there. So if you have anything, please feel free to share that in the chat. So I'm going to shift now for the last bit of time that we have together, and I'm just going to share some of the resources that I tend to go to and I found particularly useful. A few different examples of ways to mobilize evaluation results, and then some that I've used in my own work. Okay, So this is a website. It's Stephanie Evergreen, and it's all about data visualization. And so she's got fabulous resources on her website. I encourage you to go take a peek. Webinars, all kinds of things, but she's got this blog that she puts out that's fantastic. And the one blog that I just loved was, "Why is no one reading your report?" So this is for Jason. So her kind of takeaways were, it's way too freaking long, right? So she suggests a 1-3-25 reporting model. And actually 25 is still fairly short for an evaluation report. But it's kind of one, like, what are the key highlights in one page? If you only had a one page, or if it was an infographic. 3 is your executive summary, and 25 is where you can, share all that wonderful, stuff that you did in your logic model and your methods and all of that. The good stuff is buried in the back. So oftentimes we wait to share our conclusions after we've set everything up. And so she suggests flip that in your report and bring it right up front. It's written in some kind of unaccessible language, right? Like we're using lots of acronyms or faux academic jargon. So kind of thinking about, who your audience is and what's most appropriate and how should you be sharing that information. It lacks visuals, so making it, more visually appealing and understandable. So kind of there's multiple ways of looking at that for your readers and your viewers. And it looks like it was made in Word. This would definitely be me because it's like the one program that I actually know how to use. But in the next slide, you'll see that there are all kinds of other platforms and applications. So some are free, some are not. But there's PictoChart, there's Canva, there's lots of incredible tools now that you can use for designing. And you can look like a fabulous designer by using some of these tools when you go to do your reporting. Another one that I came across was Podbean. And so this is actually enables you to host like a podcast, and you can broadcast your findings or your story. Data dashboards are another way of doing this. Again, you have to think about capacity. Some of these have a budget, so your budget, how much time can you invest in learning these things? And then finally, I've just got a couple websites here. So one is Better Evaluation. I don't know if you've come across this or this has been shared in the past, but they have so many resources. It's a fantastic website, so I encourage you to take a peek. Ripple Network is a colleague of mine at the University of Ottawa that does a lot, or sorry, at Queen's University, not Ottawa, does a lot of work in knowledge mobilization. So some fabulous kind of templates and planners online there. And then of course, Christy mentioned I'm with the Evaluation Capacity Network, and we have a repository, and the repository's got all kinds of tools, resources, applications, templates, and things too. So if you're looking for resources, I encourage you to kind of poke around on our website as well. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly share a few examples. So Jason talked a lot about representing data. So, sometimes, presenting a bunch of statistics can be wonderful for those people that like to talk about statistics and look at numbers in certain ways, but you can also create infographics, right? And infographics are a very visual way of actually distilling a lot of information into really kind of visually appealing and engaging, and they're actually easy to sort of understand. And in those cases, it would be important to think about how do you actually have the infographic match the context in which you program. So if it's youth mentoring, you've got imagery of youth, or you've got different kind of images that actually make sense for the information that you're sharing. Another strategy that we've used, and again, this is more challenging because it's more resource intensive, but creating kind of more comprehensive like films or video resources with a complementary guidebook. So the two examples here came out of kind of research and evaluation projects, but it was a different mechanism for showcasing findings and then actually getting it in the hands of decision makers, funders, and it's kind of like a really quite powerful mechanism for sharing evaluation data, right? And it sort of perked, many people's attention. Engaging community reports. So yes, a report is important, and so you want to report on your findings, but thinking about how you can use imagery and visuals from the actual evaluation itself. So, we always try and get permission to take photos as we're collecting data, whether it's of the data we're collecting, of participants that are involved, as long as that's appropriate to do, or even the environments in which the program is taking place. You'll see the example on the right-hand side. They're actually presenting statistics. These are pie charts and a bar graph, but it's all about healthy eating in communities. So, instead of your typical pie chart, they're using a bicycle wheel, a scale, and a tomato, and cigarettes to demonstrate, so you can think about how you can sort of use different visuals to get your points across. And then just in the next slide, oh, this is one of those ones where it advances. So this was a project where through the Evaluation Capacity Network, we really wanted to understand the evaluation capacity of those in the social serving sector and primarily the early childhood sector. So we actually used multiple methods of data collection, but also of engagement. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see there's a report there. We actually sent out kind of a really accessible, like a white paper about when we talk about evaluation, what do we mean by that? We had some provocative questions because we wanted people to think about those questions before we hosted dialogues across the province. We also sent them a questionnaire, and the questionnaire asked about individual and organizational capacity around evaluation. And we actually used these two documents, right? And the findings from that questionnaire they filled out, the questions we had them think about in those dialogues that we had over the course of a day. And we went kind of around the province to offer those. And then we did report on that. We reported on it in very formal ways. We wrote reports, 2 of them, but we also presented back the findings, right? And we kind of held presentations about that. So but thinking about multiple methods, right? Another project, we'll just go to the next slide. We were gathering information. It was a project in partnership with some First Nation communities, and we were really trying to understand the healthy development of young children in their communities. And we had done a lot of qualitative data collection. So we had been hosting focus groups and interviews with elders and parents and educators in the community members, and with youth. And we had so much data. And actually, one of the elders had talked about the health and development of a child like the growth and development of a flower. And so we thought, well, this is such a beautiful illustration, and let's use this as a way of representing data. And so actually we used the visual metaphor to represent the data, and that's how we were able to share it back with communities. And that really resonated with the community. And we'll just go to the next slide. So through that same project, we had a number of undergraduate students that worked with us, and they were from those particular communities. One of them was an artist, and he actually painted the metaphor, and we were able to replicate the painting and give that to the schools and the communities that participated. So they sort of had a visual of the project and the data. Also, each of the students wrote a report through a newsletter back to their community. So we kind of looked at different mechanisms and methods for doing this. And then the final piece, as I mentioned, we had so much information and data, and we wanted to share that back with each community. We had a community-based committee in each community, so that was our starting place. And they really provided guidance and feedback on where were the most appropriate places, who to share the information with, what information to share, and in what ways. So, they made recommendations like show up at the health fair and have conversations, come to our kindergarten graduation, chat with parents. We've got newsletters. They had different community events. We also decided together that we would host a full day communication workshop with each community. So, it was sort of an opportunity to present the data and have those that participated think about it, do some personal reflection, do some group discussion. and then really develop a communication plan about how they would share and mobilize those findings with their community or any other stakeholders that made sense, right? And every community made different decisions about that. And so it was like, how could we follow through on that with the community? And then I'm getting close to my time here. So I know that you've been exposed to arts-based methods. And what's lovely about arts-based methods is oftentimes you can use the data you collected actually as a way of sharing evaluation findings. Some of those examples, this is not an example of mine, but I've seen this done through like dance and theater. So kind of presenting findings through dance. And I think if you're working with youth and children, this is a lovely way to represent findings. Another way that I've done in several projects is something called photo voice. So it involves a group of community members or individuals taking photos in response to an issue of importance to the community or a question that's been asked by the community. And so in one of my projects, we were working on evaluating a supportive housing model for teen families. So we asked these teen families, what are your experiences as a young parent? And we asked them to take photos of their experiences and, you know, raising their children. And so we'll just go to the next slide. And actually we'll skip that because that's the question. And so parents were able to sort of generate images, and then we met together as a group and we had them discuss the images that they had shared. And these are sort of the quotes, right? Like, this is what a parent would say, this is why I took this photo. And so we were able to actually, like Jason talked about, kind of doing some of that thematic analysis around what we were hearing. But we were also able to attach photos to quotes that parents had. We'll just go to the next slide. This is just another example. But what we were able to do is use the data itself, not only to understand this supportive housing model, how teen families were experiencing raising their children, what they wanted, you know, to see in this particular supportive housing model in terms of, you know, some shifts and changes that would support them in raising healthy young children. So we were able to, we'll just go to the next slide. We were able to shift that into a photo exhibit. So we hosted kind of a photo exhibit with these families. So we had photos all over a house that we were sharing with the community. We kind of opened it up. We invited anybody that wanted to come. We created a photo book about the project itself. City Hall picked up on it, and they wanted to display the photos in City Hall. So there was a photo exhibit there for a while. Got picked up by the media, and so there were some media stories. And then at the time, so this dates it because we were an NDP government at the time, the housing minister caught wind of it and said, hey, I want to know about this project. What's going on? I'm coming for a visit. And what was really interesting about that is we hadn't anticipated that outcome. So earlier in the talk, I said, you know, try and think about, anticipate various stakeholders that might be interested and some of those actions that you would want to see. And this was like us kind of bumping into policy in this project. And so kind of, you know, trying to, in the moment, be ready to respond to what came of it. So I know that that's been a whirlwind, and I talked probably for a lot longer than I was supposed to. But we'll just go to the next slide. If you want to learn more about the work that we're doing at the ECN, I encourage you to check out our website, send us an email if you've got any questions. We've got some upcoming events that you may be interested in on May 16th and May 26th. The one on May 16th is about culturally responsive and equity-based evaluation. Again, it's similar time frame, so a lunch and learn. And then the 26th is hearing about some community-based evaluation projects and some evaluation capacity events. So I will stop talking there and open it up, I think, for questions, but it looks like Kirsty's got, oh yeah, she's got a poll as well as some questions. So I think it's That was
Thanks.
was a whirlwind.
I think it was a well-received whirlwind though. Thank you very much, Rekha. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A. In the meantime, I'm going to sort of launch our final poll before we get into how to access your certificate if you watched all of them, and other places that we'd appreciate some feedback. So I'll launch that. It should take you maybe like a couple seconds, maybe a minute to reply to. There's 5 questions there. And in the meantime, I'm going to put some things in the chat. Okay. So as always, to access most of our resources and our recordings, coaching, all of the resources that we share with you, some of the things that we've talked about today will be shared on there. Please sign up for our resource website at eval.albertamentors.ca. Because this is the last pre-eval webinar, if you have watched all 8, we really ask that you complete our feedback. It takes 5 minutes, and if you could spare 5 minutes just to help us with this so that we can make sure that we are doing a good job and can continue to offer resources and opportunities like this, that would be really helpful. So there's the link to the questionnaire as well. If you need to access the questionnaire, you can access it through the eval.albertamentors.ca website. Everything is there. And as same thing with the certificate, you can access the application for your certificate at the website, but I'll post it here. So what you'll have to do is you'll have to go in and either enter that you've attended each webinar live, or enter the code that is on the recordings, just so that we can then process it and get you your recording back afterwards. Get you your certificate back afterwards. If you attended less than half of the time of one of the webinars, we're going to ask that you watch the recording and get the code to enter instead of saying that you attended live. And so I see a question about accessing the recordings. Yes, all the recordings are available on our eval.albertamentors.ca website. And of course, if you have any difficulties accessing anything, you can email me at kirsty@ualberta.ca. And same with any questions, comments, feedback, please just let us know. If you need anything at all, really, evaluation related. And with that, I'll say thanks to everybody. And yeah, please feel free to stay on, put anything in the chat or questions, but otherwise that's all she wrote. Thanks, everybody.